Bhagavad Gita as it is. Chapter 8, Text 3. Shri Bhagavanu Vacha Aksharam Brahma Paramam Svabhavodhyatmamuchyate Bhuta Bhavodbhavakaro Visargaha Karma Samnitaha. Synonyms. Shri Bhagavan Uvacha, the Supreme Personality of Godhead said, Aksharam, indestructible, Brahma, Brahman, Paramam, transcendental, Svabhavaha, eternal nature, Adhyatmam, the self, Uchyate, is called, Bhuta Bhava Udbhava Karaha, action producing the material bodies of the living entities, Visargaha, creation, Karma, fruitive activities, Samnitaha, is called. Translation. The Supreme Lord said, the indestructible transcendental living entity is called Brahman and his eternal nature is called the Self. Action pertaining to the development of these material bodies is called karma or fruitive activities. Purport. Brahman is indestructible and eternally existing, and its constitution is not changed at any time. But beyond Brahman there is Parabrahman. Brahman refers to the living entity, and Parabrahman refers to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. The constitutional position of the living entity is different from the position he takes in the material world. In material consciousness, his nature is to try to be the Lord of matter, but in spiritual, Krishna consciousness, his position is to serve the Supreme. When the living entity is in material consciousness, he has to take on various bodies in the material world. That is called karma or varied creation by the force of material consciousness. In Vedic literature, the living entity is called Jivatma and Brahman, but he is never called Parabrahman. The living entity, Jivatma, takes different positions. Sometimes he merges into the dark material nature and identifies himself with matter, and sometimes he identifies himself with the superior spiritual nature. Therefore, he is called the Supreme Lord's marginal energy. According to his identification with material or spiritual nature, he receives a material or spiritual body. In material nature, he may take a body from any of the 8,400,000 species of life, but in spiritual nature, he has only one body. In material nature, he is sometimes manifested as a man, demigod, an animal, a beast, bird, etc., according to his karma. To attain material heavenly planets and enjoy their facilities, he sometimes performs sacrifices, yajna, but when his merit is exhausted, he returns to earth again in the form of a man. In the process of sacrifice, the living entity makes specific sacrifices to attain specific heavenly planets and consequently reaches them. When the merit of sacrifice is exhausted, then the living entity descends to earth in the form of rain, then takes on the form of grains, and the grains are eaten by man and transformed into semen, which impregnates a woman, and thus the living entity once again attains the human form to perform sacrifice and so repeat the same cycle. In this way, the living entity perpetually comes and goes on the material path. The Krishna conscious person, however, avoids such sacrifices. He takes directly to Krishna consciousness and thereby prepares himself to return to Godhead. Impersonalist commentators on the Gita unreasonably assume that Brahman takes the form of Jiva in the material world. And to substantiate this, they refer to chapter 15 verse 7 of the Gita. But this verse also speaks of the living entity as an eternal fragment of myself. The fragment of God, the living entity, may fall down into the material world, but the Supreme Lord, Achyuta, never falls down. Therefore, this assumption that the Supreme Brahman assumes the form of Jiva is not acceptable. It is important to remember that in Vedic literature, Brahman, the living entity, is distinguished from Parabrahman, the Supreme Lord. Text 4. Adhibhutam ksharo bhavaha purushaschaadidevatam adhiyajñohamevatra dehe dehabhritam vara. Synonyms. Adhibhutam, the physical manifestation. Ksharaha, constantly changing. Bhavaha, nature. Purushaha, the universal form. Cha, and. Adhidevatam, including all demigods like the sun and moon. Adhiyajñaha, the super soul. Aham, I, Krishna. Eva, certainly. Atra, in this. Dehe, body. Deha bhritam, of the embodied. Vara, the supreme. Translation. Physical nature is known to be endlessly mutable. The universe is the cosmic form of the Supreme Lord, and I am that Lord represented as the Super Soul dwelling in the heart of every embodied being. Purport. The physical nature is constantly changing. Material bodies generally pass through 6 stages. They are born, they grow, they remain for some duration, they produce some byproducts, they dwindle, and then they vanish. This physical nature is called Adhibhutam. Because it is created at a certain point and will be annihilated at a certain point, the conception of the universal form of the Supreme Lord that includes all the demigods and their different planets is called Adhidevatam. The individual soul, Jiva, accompanies the body. The super soul, a plenary representation of Lord Krishna, is called the Paramatma or Adhiyajña and is situated in the heart. The word Eva is particularly important in the context of this verse because by this word the Lord stresses that the Paramatma is not different from him. The Super Soul, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, seated beside the individual soul, is the witness of the individual soul's activities and is the source of consciousness. The Super Soul gives the Jiva an opportunity to act freely and he witnesses his activities. The functions of all these different manifestations of the Supreme Lord automatically become clarified for the pure Krishna conscious devotee engaged in transcendental service of the Lord. The gigantic universal form of the Lord called Adhidevatam is contemplated by the neophyte who cannot approach the Supreme Lord in his manifestation as Super Soul. The neophyte is advised to contemplate the universal form whose legs are considered the lower planets and whose eyes are considered the sun and moon and whose head is considered the upper planetary system.